Mr. Commissioner, I'm Krista Robertson, Counsel for the Musqueam-Zaudinnik Tribal Council. Good afternoon, panel. I just have a very few questions for you about a matter that hasn't come up so far on this panel, and that is the presence of Atlantic salmon farms on the migratory route of Fraser River sockeye as a management issue. We do have hearings coming up on this topic, but we won't have an opportunity to hear your views from a management perspective at that time, so I'd like to canvass your views now. Mr. Cray, on the Lower Fraser groups that you work with, is this a management concern, that being that Fraser River sockeye juveniles are likely to encounter salmon farms in the marine approach areas?
We have Mr. Commissioner, we have an elaborate monitoring program on the Lower Fraser. I think Chief Ken Malloway may have described that when he was here a number of weeks back, how we monitor our fisheries. For a decade and a half now, our fishermen have been catching Atlantic salmon in their nets, not in great numbers, but they've been picking them up in their nets and reporting them to our monitors. And that's when our concerns about salmon farms first arose. And over the last decade and a half, but certainly in recent years, there's been a lot of concern in the community about disease transfer between salmon farms and wild sockeye stocks of Fraser origin and other salmon species that swim by or close to these facilities, these salmon farms. And there's a lot of questions. There is a lot of concern. I don't think that people have sufficient information in Stalo country to draw any hard and fast conclusions, except to say that they're concerned.
Thank you, and that is really my next question to you, Mr. Craze. Have you communicated these concerns with DFO, and do you feel that you've been given enough information from DFO around these potential risks to your satisfaction?
The concerns have been expressed, but we're like other British Columbians. What we hear largely from the department is they have some concerns, but by and large they're supportive of the salmon farms. And they don't seem to have a lot of concern about some of these issues. I'm not so sure why that is, but that's when we engage with them about the salmon farms. They don't express a lot of anxiety about it. And a lot of what we hear is support for this growing industry, and it's substantial now. More particularly, though, we have environmental groups. This morning I referred to them as the green people. You know, we have the red people, the white people, and now there's the green people, the environmentalists. They have come into our territory and they've talked to us a lot about salmon farms and the issue of disease transfer and the like. And it adds to our concern and alarm. And I understand that's one of the issues that this Commission of Inquiry is examining. And so we await with everyone else what the conclusions the Commission reaches and any recommendations that might flow from that.
Thank you. And just to clarify, when you say you hear support, do you mean support from DFO for aquaculture? You had mentioned that you hear support.
Yes, on a number of occasions, the previous Minister of Fisheries, Gail Shea, made trips to the West Coast, took part in promotional events associated with salmon farms, and I think even went to Norway, Mr. Commissioner, promoting additional Norwegian investment in salmon farms on British Columbia's coastline.
Thank you. And Mr. Shepherd, in terms of your participation in the Upper Fraser groups, what's been your experience around management concerns? Are they on the radar of your group?
We've done a lot of cross-pollinization with other inland First Nations groups, for example, Skeena. And I know that there's been some information exchanged. I know that the Skeena Watershed Authority, which is run by the First Nations on the Skeena have had their council draft a letter stating that the potential impact or the potential for impacts to First Nations rights to their fishery are real and substantial, and therefore they have basically requested an all-out a moratorium on any new licensing for aquaculture in their region, because they feel that it can and potentially will impact their ability to access fish in the future.
And Mr. Shepherd, I'll just stay with you for a moment. Are you aware then that DFO at the end of 2010 took over the regulation and licensing of aquaculture from the province?
I am.
And were you ever involved in any kind of consultation or information sharing processes with DFO around the development of a new regulatory regime for aquaculture?
No.
Mr. Cray, have your groups ever been involved in consulting with DFO around development of regulation of aquaculture? Salmon aquaculture, that is.
No, but I think I do recall a note or a letter being circulated to the First Nations inviting some opinion, inviting us to get information from the department. I can't distinctly remember the letter in its date, but I do recall something of that nature coming around, being circulated. And like Mr. Shepherd has pointed out, I think a number of our First Nations have sent letters out to the department asking that there be a halt put to net pens in water, marine waters, and support for closed containment salmon farming.
Thank you. Mr. Shepherd, back to you for just a moment. You say it's not an issue that's coming up necessarily in the Upper Fraser management groups, but are you aware that the juvenile Fraser River sockeye are running past salmon farms in the marine approach areas?
Absolutely.
And based on the potential for there to be an interaction between the farm salmon and the wild salmon, in your view, should DFO be consulting with the Fraser River groups, the Upper Fraser River groups, around licensing of these farms and the regulation of them?
It's really an area outside of my expertise. I don't feel comfortable commenting on that right now. Yeah, it is what it is. Sorry.
It's okay, thank you. Mr. Wilson, can I turn to you? Given the importance of the Fraser River sockeye to the Heiltsuk, do you feel that you're getting enough information from DFO around the management of salmon farming and the potential risks of salmon farming and the Fraser River sockeye?
No. In regards to consultation, we have a position against the new regulations that went to the federal government, and it probably got to stage 2 of the best practices on Canada's consultation paper. So we do have a position on establishing new farms, because we do have a couple farms in our territory. And we've also engaged in a study to see the impacts of lice on juveniles as they got closer to the salmon farm. I believe it's going to come up when you have a aquaculture presentation. Right,
thank you. And just for the purpose of this, just trying to focus on to what extent, as a management issue, are salmon farm licensing coming to your tables? Just one last question then around the actual licensing of aquaculture. This is post December 18th, 2010. For all three of you, has DFO consulted with you about the issuance of actual licenses of salmon farms on the migratory routes of Fraser River sockeye?
On the migratory routes?
Yes.
No.
As I mentioned, I know a circular came around. I don't think it was necessarily soliciting our opinion about whether or not one particular farm or the other, or a particular set of regulations, soliciting our point of view on that. We're alive to the issue, but And while it's definitely on our radar screen, in our community we've had some of our cultural and spiritual people. One of them was here the other day, sitting in the back, who's actively involved where the salmon farm issue is concerned and works with the groups that are involved with it. Has worked with our communities to try to inform us about what the issues and concerns may be. But I can't recall, I could be wrong, a letter or an invite asking for our opinions about licensing or any proposed regulations.
Thank you. Mr. Shepherd?
The answer is for me a no.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Mr. Commissioner, I think we're at the time of redirect, and I understand from Mr. McGowan that I have 5 minutes. So I'll do my best to finish. I just have a couple of housekeeping. First of all, Mr. Shepherd, if you'd only done this once, I wouldn't have had to do this, but you did this a couple of times. So can I go to Exhibit 493? You referenced our place at the table as 2002. I wonder if I could show you the inside page of Exhibit 493 and bring you into 2004.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so then I'd like to take, Mr. Rosenberger, may I take you to may I have an Exhibit 1271 and 1235 up side by side?
1271 and 1235?
Yes, please. 1271 is the document you referred to earlier, Mr. Rosenberger. That's the 2009 management guidelines for sharing arrangements when we can't meet FSC harvest targets. And you spoke about that as being the guidelines the department is using right now. Mr. Huber was able to confirm Exhibit 1235 in the evidence yesterday or earlier last week, I guess now, but wasn't able to speak much about it. Are you familiar with the second document? The one on the left? It's dated April 15th, 2010, so it's a year later, and it's a much thicker document with a fair bit of, if you could scroll down through that document, that might help, Mr. Rosenberger. Are you familiar with that document?
Yes, I am.
And is that the document the department is now using to consider issues around equitable sharing when we can't reach FSC requirements?
Yeah, I think the second document is really updating on the first, and the general principles of sharing between the 3 geographic areas based on their license allocation is the key, and then it describes some other options and things to consider in moving past that.
Do you know whether these have been the subject of dialogue or discussions, these principles that you've set out in April 15th, 2010 with the First Nations on the Fraser River?
Yes.
So you have taken these this document and these principles, the principles in the second one, to actual meetings?
I'm not certain that the document has been there. There was a PowerPoint deck that was provided at the second forum meeting this year. I believe it was at the second or third one, that were describing some options that trying to work our way through this and show the options and how the department is using this and whether the First Nations thought those were most appropriate or they had other ideas or places where that they could use this document to help them in their discussions on trying to come up with a sharing arrangement.
But the actual Exhibit 1235 has not been shared?
I'm not certain whether that actual document was shared or not.
All right. Could I now go to Exhibit 1274? You'll recall your evidence earlier, Mr. Rosenberger, on this document and explaining some of the examples your council went through as to how to move some of the shares from PIC fee acquired buyback licenses or ATP buyback licenses into the Fraser River. And I'm just curious if you just step back for a moment. It appears that the approach the department is using in this document isn't driven really by conservation. It's driven by what we've acquired in the commercial fishery and therefore what we can move into the upper river. And would you agree that in addition to that practical exercise, it might also be useful to look at what we need to harvest in the upper river for conservation purposes, and that flexibility would be useful to you?
I think the document was trying to demonstrate both parts. That's where I described that there's a couple of pieces on the pie in the latter parts of the document where We've now have these licenses which allow us to have a share of the total allowable catch. Not all that catch that we've moved from the mixed stock fishery is all being reallocated in other areas. So parts of those are being used for conservation purposes, and that the places where there are abundant stocks, like in last year in this example, is showing for Chilco and Adams, whatever those parts are, that part is allocated out.
Sir, I don't think I thank you for that. You did explain fairly well this morning about how for those stocks of imminent concern, you're protecting some of that reallocate or the buyback area. But my question went more to, if you step back from the buyback for a moment, you recognize that there are benefits for harvesting in the known fisheries for conservation purposes, like harvesting for commercial purposes. That shouldn't only be driven by PIC fee acquired allocations. It should be driven by an overview of the fishery and looking at what's necessary, what's beneficial for conservation purposes.
That underlies the whole fishery, not just this part. So that's where conservation is the first priority, and you need to meet those objectives. We do that, as was described earlier in the January or February sessions with the harvest management. There's management adjustments, First Nations allocations we're striving for. So I might be missing the point, but this is not the only document or the only process that's driving conservation.
I think I better not take any more time given it. Thanks. Thanks.
Lisa Fong for Heiltsuk Tribal Council. My question is for Mr. Wilson. Ms. Robertson, you told Ms. Robertson that there were 2 salmon farms on Heiltsuk territory. My question for you is this. Was Heiltsuk consulted regarding, by either DFO or the province, depending when that time was, I guess, was Heiltsuk consulted about these salmon farms, and did Heiltsuk agree to have these salmon farms on their territory?
They were consulted, but not to the degree of the best practices paper, and we never agreed.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Mr. Commissioner Marquis for the Government of Canada. Just one question for Mr. Rosenberger. Earlier today, Mr. Isaac was asking some questions about allegations of fishing during closed times and allegations of sale of FSC fish contrary to the terms of a license. And one of the questions asked of you, Mr. Rosenberger, was whether you were aware of information about these issues provided to you by conservation and protection officials at DFO. Well, what I wasn't clear on is whether you had any further follow-up to that as to what your views are on the information that you received. And I just want to give you an opportunity to comment on that.
There's been a number of discussions and information provided over a number of years that I've been in the department. One that might help to clarify some parts of this discussion, at least from the Upper Fraser's point of view. After the last inquiry, which may not have been the formal title, but when Justice Williams was looking at Fraser sockeye issues, one of the recommendations was to do an in-depth study of illegal fishing that had been raised in that process, which is somewhat similar, that's still of concern today. So in the BC Interior, there was a relatively in-depth process and study that occurred in 2005 and 2006, working cooperatively between the various parts of the department. The resource management folks working with the conservation and protection staff were able to collect a series of data, look at catch rates in open fisheries, counting of illegal nets and fish that they were able to, the CMP folks seized. The results of those studies indicated that, and it's very difficult, I should add, describing the process here, to get somebody who's just been apprehended for some illegal activity to give you a lot of information on their catch rates and things like that we ask legitimate fishers, so they tend not to be quite as cooperative in that process. But there are ways of trying to work your way through some of those details, so there's the documentation of how that occurs. But there's also those 2 studies with fairly limited expansion of data indicate that the numbers are probably more in the 1,000 sockeye level in each of those 2 years. So substantiating information, I think, is the key thing that needs to be done and being able to take into account in an appropriate manner. There was a similar study in 2005 in the Lower Fraser. I don't think it was quite as successful in gathering all the data, but the same way that we try to use that kind of information in our decisions and process.
Those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I have a few questions in re-examination. Picking up just where Mr. East left off with the studies you were referring to, those were studies for the BC Interior only, is that correct?
The two studies I described that I have much more information on in 05 and 06 were in the BC Interior, but I also mentioned that there was a study that went on in 05 in the Lower Fraser.
Thank you. If we could have the Canada's list of documents number 22 up, perhaps just to put the document in front of you I think you're referring to. Oh, perhaps it's, yes, that's Canada's list at number 22. Is this the document you were referring to?
Yes, it is.
And these were the more complete studies that you were referring to, correct?
That's correct.
These dealt with, as we said, the BC Interior only?
This study does, that's correct.
Only for the years 2005 and 2006?
That's correct.
And I see the reference there to no expansion. And is the reference to no expansion an indication that there was not an expansion factor applied for times when CMP may not have been in the area or been patrolling to detect any of the activity that's referred to in the chart?
No, it's not referring to no patrols. So if you go to the middle portion there between columns, bead E would describe the relative patrols that were undertaken in any of the given subdivision of the BC Interior, so it's Mid-Fraser, Upper Fraser, and Upper Fraser.
Yes.
And I don't have the delineation of those. The expansion, there's relatively little of the data is expanded, and it's where we have some information where a fisher officer, for example, observed an illegal net during a closed time. They may or may not have, well, they did not, in this case, retrieve that net themselves at that point, but waited to try to observe this, to identify who might have been fishing that net. So they have a time frame now that they can use for the information. So if that person subsequently picked the net a couple of hours later, you can get more specific catch per unit effort as opposed to trying to use data from a fishery before or after. The other side of this is trying, where we thought we had limited information on the trying to match up the frequencies of patrols to some of the periods of monitoring of each of the areas.
Okay, thank you. So does this include information about when fishery officers were not on the water, or only information about when they were on the water?
Well, when you expanded, it's for times and or locations that they weren't present.
Okay, and that expansion, it says no expansion. Does that mean that expansion was not applied to these numbers?
That's correct.
Okay. I wonder if that should be the next exhibit, just to help complete Mr. Rosenberger's evidence on that issue.
The next exhibit will be 1,283.
And if we could have exhibit 1274, please, specifically, if we could go to page 28, and then to page, starting at page 28, please. Mr. Rosenberg, this is the PowerPoint presentation that Mr. East took you to, dealing with the commercial First Nations inland demonstration fisheries. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
I just want to make sure I understand your evidence on this point. The page we're looking at now shows really the extraction of 12.46% out of the conventional commercial fleet by through the pig fee buyback, and then ultimately a reallocation to First Nation demonstration fisheries, some reserved for conservation. Is that a fair overview?
Well, subsequent ones show that. So this is
Yes.
just, this is showing that there's a portion of the whole, and that the portion is made up by, in this case, 3 different stock groups.
Okay, thank you. And if we can flip to the next page then that you were referencing, this shows a reallocation of those pieces of the fishery, correct?
Which were allocated in the year 2010. That's
Okay.
correct.
So 12.46% was taken out and 12.46 was reallocated. Is that correct?
No. So 12.46 was taken out. And then the areas where there's 2 or 3 areas, there's 2 areas on there. So the very top wording where it says 12.46% of Bower and Gates, Nadina, Pitt, da-da-da.
Yeah, sorry, my question was sloppy. You had explained this before, that some of them were retained for conservation purposes and
That's
not
correct.
reallocated.
So they're not all reallocated. Those stocks of concern were not allocated out.
But the stocks that weren't of concern and that were reallocated, they were reallocated at the level of 12.46%?
There's 3 different agreements, and I have one of them in my head, and it was, I'm assuming that they all were, but I'm not certain that I could say that for certain right now.
Okay, my question then is, where in this calculation is the issue of en route mortality taken into account?
Well, that comes into account before you get to it's taken into account before you calculate the total allowable catch.
Yes, but a total allowable catch, if 1,000 fish are caught in the marine area, if you leave those same 1,000 fish, assuming they were all heading to one area, a number of those would die after they were available to the conventional commercial fleet before they get to the terminal areas, would they not?
Potentially. So the accounting for that, for the purposes of Fraser management, occurs at mission.
Okay. Is there any calculation when you're dealing with these reallocations which takes into account en-route mortality from mission to the terminal area that's applied?
We don't apply the management adjustment to allowable catch. We only apply the management adjustment to meet the escapement objective.
Thank you. If we could turn then to document 1273, please. Okay, I must have the wrong number then. I'm looking for a document that was put to Mr. Rosenberger titled ONA Pilot Demo Catch.
1272.
1272, thank you. You recall this was a document put to you by Mr. East when he was asking you questions about commercial viability of in-river demonstration fisheries?
I do.
And this is a document which deals with not a Fraser sockeye catch, but another sockeye in-river demonstration fishery, and sets out some of the numbers that were caught along with some of the prices which were for which the fish were sold at. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Is this the extent of the analysis with respect to commercial viability that was done with respect to this project?
For the Okanogans, this slide and the subsequent one with the pricing on it is taken from about a 60-page deck that the Okanagan Nation Alliance provided on talking about some of the work that they were doing. It had a number of items around the management objectives, their food fishery, parts like that. So this is not a complete presentation of that deck.
Okay. Do you know what the cost of the catch monitoring associated with this fishery was?
Should know.
And I realize I'm putting you on the spot, so if you...
Well, I'm aware of it. I've had to sign off on the documents, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. Sorry.
And do you know what the wages paid to the fishers were that were associated with this fishery?
No.
Okay. Has DNA done, or has the Department of Fisheries and Oceans done with respect to this demonstration fishery, or with respect to any other demonstration fisheries, a full economic viability analysis which takes into account the cost of catch monitoring, the cost of wages paid, variations in the return of stocks over years, to determine what the commercial viability of any of these demonstration fisheries is moving forward?
There's been studies done in the Fraser since 1993 on viability of fish meeting inspection standards, what that would take, the potential changes in fisheries management, potential benefits of some of these fish foregone catch because of mixed stock and stocks of concern issues in the marine side of things. There's a couple of studies, not certain the years, but I think it's late 90s and a couple of in the 2000s that the department commissioned. And then First Nations people, which I believe feeds into an annual accounting, which was called is called a PICFI report that's put out annually on all the different fisheries, has some of that type of data in it. But so when you talk about a comprehensive one, I'm not certain whether those cover off all of your issues, but there are places it's being looked at. I'm not certain that they've all come together in one place.
And to some extent that's being done under the PICFI program?
It's almost exclusively being done under PICFI at this stage.
Thank you. Follow up with Ms. Stewart about that. I have one final very brief question for you, Mr. Shepherd. You told Mr. Dixon in response to his question that you favored a straight quantum allocation with no restrictions with respect to sale to First Nations. At present, there's efforts made to...
I don't believe I said that.
Okay, that perhaps I misquoted you then. Maybe clarify what you...
I think that a good starting point is to allow a quantum of fish to be transferred immediately so that we can get on with the business of managing our own fisheries. That's more or less what I would say.
Okay, does your vision of an initial first step include priority for the entirety of the allocation for First Nations include in terms of management, the way priority is applied to FSC fish at present?
So the question is, when a quantum of fish is being, say, hypothetically being transferred to the First Nation, does it still get afforded the same FSC priority?
Yes, is that what you're seeking or what you're proposing?
I think that would be in the best interest of conservation.
Thank you. Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Mr. Commissioner, I left one question unfinished. If I may have your indulgence, I don't think it'll take long. Okay, all right.
If it's very quick.
I promise it'll be very quick. Mr. Shepherd, in Mr. Dixon's questions of you, he was speaking on the issue of having a facilitator or mediator, and referred to Russ Jones's evidence. Russ Jones's evidence was that he felt it would be useful to have judicial oversight, such as a Commissioner Cohen, to try to have the parties complete the work of co-management. With that information in front of you, do you think that is a useful recommendation?
As somebody who works in the field, I do. I think, and again, having studied both Maori and the Washington State models, these were critical pieces to making the positive change that eventually affected the entire fishery. Yes, we need judicial oversight, and I would recommend, I would like to have somebody like Commissioner Cohen be that person.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much. Well, it's been a long day, a long couple of days. Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Cray again, Mr. Shepherd, and Mr. Rosenberger. This is, I think, second or perhaps third time that you've been here. Thank you very much. I do appreciate very much your taking the time to attend here, your willingness to answer the questions of council and Mr. Eidsvik, and I wish you well. Thank you very much. We're adjourned then until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock?
Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you.